The air was tense as the bell rang, signaling the start of a routine Friday morning at Green Hill High. Students shuffled through the hallways, chatting about weekend plans, exams, and life. In classroom 4B, Mrs. Reynolds was starting her English lesson, unaware that this day would soon turn into a nightmare. "All right, class, let's discuss symbolism in." Mrs. Reynolds paused as the school's intercom crackled to life. "Attention all students and faculty. We are now in lockdown. This is not a drill." The words sent a chill down everyone's spine. Mrs. Reynolds' face tightened as she calmly instructed everyone to move to the corner of the room, away from the windows. "Stay quiet," she whispered, her voice betraying her unease. Emily, a shy sophomore, sat huddled between her best friend Jessica and a group of her classmates. She could feel her heart racing. Lockdowns were rare, and even when they happened, they were usually drills. But something felt off. The silence in the hallways was unnatural, eerie. Minutes ticked by like hours. The faint sound of distant footsteps echoed through the corridor outside, growing closer. Emily exchanged a glance with Jessica, both girls wide-eyed, trembling. The door rattled. A slow, deliberate knock followed. Mrs. Reynolds froze, motioning for everyone to stay quiet. Emily held her breath, her pulse hammering in her ears. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a deep, raspy voice that seemed to scratch at the edges of reality. "Let me in." The voice wasn't familiar. It wasn't the friendly tone of Principal Davis or even a staff member. It was something else, something darker. Emily gripped Jessica's hand, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Mrs. Reynolds silently gestured to lock the door, but before she could reach it, the door creaked open on its own. A gust of cold air swept into the room, and the lights flickered, plunging them into semi-darkness. Emily felt her stomach drop. A figure stepped into the room. It was a man, but not like anyone Emily had ever seen. He was tall, impossibly tall, with a face obscured by shadows. His eyes, if they were eyes, glowed faintly in the dim light, casting an unnatural aura that chilled Emily to the bone. His smile was wide, far too wide, as if his mouth could split his face in two. "Why are you hiding?" the man asked, his voice a mockery of warmth. He took slow, deliberate steps toward the class, each footfall echoing unnervingly loud in the quiet room. Mrs. Reynolds stepped forward, blocking his path. "You need to leave," she said, her voice strong but trembling. The man tilted his head as if amused. "Leave?" He laughed softly, the sound like nails scraping against glass. "I'm afraid none of you are leaving." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had heard stories, urban legends about schools and lockdowns that ended in horror. But those were just stories, right? The man's smile faded, replaced by an expression of hunger, of malice. His gaze swept over the class, settling on Emily. She felt her skin prickle as if invisible fingers were crawling over her. "Come here," he whispered. Emily shook her head, backing into the wall. But the man wasn't waiting for her compliance. Without moving a muscle, he seemed to pull her toward him, an unseen force dragging her across the room. The other students watched in terror, unable to scream, unable to move. Jessica grabbed Emily's hand, trying to pull her back, but it was no use. The man was stronger, far stronger than any human should be. Emily could feel the cold seeping into her bones, freezing her in place. Suddenly, Mrs. Reynolds lunged at the man, swinging a heavy textbook at his head. It passed through him as though he were made of smoke. He chuckled darkly, the sound echoing like it came from deep within the earth. Brave, but futile. With a flick of his wrist, Mrs. Reynolds was thrown across the room, slamming into the wall with a sickening thud. She crumpled to the floor, unconscious. The class gasped, but still no one dared make a sound. The man turned back to Emily, his glowing eyes narrowing. "Your fear feeds me. The more you tremble, the stronger I become. You'll all be mine by the end of the day." Suddenly, a loud, high-pitched alarm blared through the speakers. It was the lockdown alarm, but it was distorted, warped like a scream mixed with static. The man flinched, his form flickering like a faulty hologram. For a split second, Emily saw something else. A hideous, monstrous figure lurking behind the man's human guise. Realizing the alarm was affecting him, Emily snapped out of her fear. She grabbed the nearest object, a desk leg that had come loose, and swung it at the man. It passed through him, but this time he staggered back, his form losing its solidity. "Everyone," Emily yelled. "Make noise. The alarm is hurting him." The class, still in shock, began to scream, shout, bang on desks, anything to create chaos. The man's body flickered wildly, his shadowy form twisting and writhing as though being torn apart. "You'll pay for this?" he hissed, his voice breaking into 1,000 distorted echoes. With one final deafening shriek, the man dissolved into a cloud of black smoke and vanished. The room fell silent except for the sound of the alarm, which soon faded. Emily stood there, panting, her heart racing. Mrs. Reynolds groaned, slowly regaining consciousness. The students looked around at each other, dazed and shaken, but alive. The lockdown was lifted an hour later, but no one could explain what had happened. The cameras in the school showed nothing unusual. No one ever saw the man again, but whispers of the lockdown from hell spread through Green Hill High, a story that would haunt them forever. Like and subscribe if you want to hear more terrifying tales that will keep you up at night. Don't miss out on the next nightmare.